As you know, today is 9/11, and in American terminology. So that reminds us that we've been campaigning against the war on terror in the streets and in the main square of York for 11 years now. Those of us who are active in opposing the political justification of earlier wars are now aware of the significant shift which has occurred in public attitude towards British involvement in the wars we are now confronting. The jingoism has seeped into the earth. We hear the change every Saturday from those who want to express their thoughts, as well as wanting to sign petitions. It has become possible for the public both to support our troops and to deplore the politicians who are increasingly seen as deceiving us as to the motives of war and using humanitarianism to cloak their militarism and their self-promoting opportunism. This is very clear, and we're seeing it every Saturday. We know, and the public now know more. I'm sure that I speak not simply for myself in saying the primary reason that we know so much more of the history and the facts of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is that we have been privileged to read the words of Jonathan Steele. His masterly analyses of the clear and compelling exposition of the progress of these wars and of the impact on events of the principal actors as a catalyst for this sea change in public opinion. Jonathan was educated at Cambridge and Yale. He was bureau chief for The Guardian in Washington and Moscow and chief foreign correspondent. He has won press awards for his reporting on Iraq and Afghanistan. His book, Ghosts of Afghanistan, The Haunted Battleground, is the definitive account of the fascination Afghanistan has exerted on potential invaders and on their inability to learn from the experience of past invaders. We are privileged indeed to have Jonathan with us. Jonathan, I'll pass the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then I hope to have questions, because I'm sure you really want to ask lots of questions and not just hear me all the time. This is a speech that I've given actually a couple of times before, and sometimes with military people in the audience. And I think it really brings home what Maurice has just said. Even among the military, there is a growing awareness that they have been fighting, have been asked to fight a hopeless war, because I've had people come up to me after saying, we actually agree with what you're saying, even though, as you're about to hear, it's a very, very anti-war speech. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to come out of London sometimes and not just go to dangerous places like Kabul and Baghdad, but come to comfortable places, nice places, peaceful, tolerant places like York. So it's very, very nice to come here. Afghanistan has been part of my life for the past 30 years. I've had the opportunity to report from that country in each of its turbulent modern phases, starting with the Soviet occupation in the 1980s, and I was there on three different occasions in Kabul and other cities. Then the ensuing civil war between the Western-backed Mujahideen Islamic fundamentalists, which lasted between 1992 and 1996. And then I was there I went there as soon as the Taliban took over in September 1996, saw what they were doing. And then, of course, since 9/11, exactly 11 years ago, I've been covering the occupation and invasion a number of times, including in Helmand with British forces a couple of years ago. I sometimes feel haunted, which is why this book is called The Haunted Battleground. Because memories of Afghanistan and the people I've met there float into my head at odd moments when I'm in London or elsewhere. Memories and questions. What is it that keeps tempting powerful foreign states to spend soldiers' lives, their own soldiers' lives, in seeking to control a country that is landlocked, not endowed with oil, and much poorer than its less invaded neighbours. And then why is it that a society that so clearly does need economic progress and development always take up arms against a few of its leaders when they do try to bring reform? Afghanistan is the poorest country in the world, apart from a few states in sub-Saharan Africa. It has a per capita income of about £700 a year. Only 73% of the people have access to safe drinking water. 16% of the kids die before they reach the age of 5. Incredibly poor country, desperately needs development, and yet every time a group comes to power in Kabul, whether it is the Soviet-backed People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan in 1973 and 1978, or whether it is people who come to power more recently, there is always an insurgency. And then why do the fundamentalists who resist reform always, unfortunately, succeed in forcing the governments to retreat? But the ghosts of my book's title are not just these wandering thoughts and memories that I have. They are the ghosts, much more importantly, of catastrophic mistakes made by earlier invaders, which are haunting Burma and Cameroon today. Because I saw, as I said, the blunders that the Soviets made in the 1980s, and I watched most of them repeated in the last few years. Anger and hubris that lead to a disastrous mission of revenge. Because let's face it, 9/11 had to be revenge, the Americans felt, and that's why they went into Afghanistan. And then regime change with slips, undebated, into nation building, so-called. And then surging more and more troops, for no reason other than the ones who died first must not seem to have lost their lives in vain. But of course the principal ghosts of Afghanistan are the dead on every side. In 38 years of unfinished civil war, made worse by 2 foreign interventions, close to 15,000 Soviet soldiers dead, around 2,000 Americans, over 400 British, and more than 500 from other countries. And above all, of course, the lost sons and daughters of Afghanistan itself. Some 20,000 fighters, and as many as 2 million civilians. 38 years. Then ghosts, in Russian, the word dukhi, happens to be the name that Soviet troops gave their Afghan opponents. Because they were elusive, ever-moving, and hard to pin down. Wearing no uniform, the ghosts struck in ambushes by day, and after dark they delivered night letters, little handwritten notes, warning fellow Afghans not to collaborate with the infidels. Of course, the Americans and British use different names for those who resist today's occupation. Awful words like towelhead or raghead. But the urge to dehumanize their shadowy opponents is just as strong as it was when the Russians were there. And today's war, just like in the Russian time, is asymmetric. Heavily equipped, high-tech forces, equipped with the most modern weapons, try to grapple with a guerrilla enemy that wears civilian clothes and never comes at you head-on. State-of-the-art night vision goggles are all very well for some purposes, but they're no use in detecting ghosts. And US and British troops can actually go through an entire 6-month tour of combat without ever knowing you've seen an insurgent alive or dead. And pilots of attack drones, and I believe you had a talk about drones quite recently, who sit in those air-conditioned bases in Nevada, never even touch the terrain on which they kill. So a central theme of this talk is the similarity of the Soviet and US interventions and the lessons which ought to be learned. Because in each case, the decision to invade was made on the grounds of protecting national security, but actually with little or no thought to the consequences Could non-Muslim outsiders really expect support in a Muslim country if they stayed for more than a few months, especially in a country that had never welcomed foreign armies? Was there not a substantial risk from the beginning that the mission would increase rather than lessen the threat of terrorist threat? Now, back in May, as you know, this year, NATO ended a two-day summit in Chicago, which set the seal on what was described as the West's exit strategy from Afghanistan. Foreign troops are supposed to leave the country by the end of 2014, after handing security responsibility to the newly trained Afghan forces. NATO says that this transition is triumph. But after 11 years of war, in which the Taliban had recovered from their defeat or retreat in 2001, to reach a point where large parts of the south and east of Afghanistan are not considered safe, every independent observer knows that this war has not reached its objectives. Indeed, the objectives have been regularly scaled back, and the Obama administration has dropped all talk of bringing democracy to Afghanistan. They merely say now that they hope to have given Afghanistan a degree of stability by the time foreign forces leave. Actually, what NATO officials are doing, basically, is just to keep their fingers crossed that they can somehow emulate the Russians, who managed to leave a friendly government in place in Kabul that lasted for 3 years after the last Soviet soldier left. So how has it gone so badly wrong? Why has it gone so badly wrong? Was the intervention doomed from the start? In the 1980s, as I say, I visited Kabul 3 times for the Guardian during the Soviet occupation. So let's start with that period. In the first few weeks after they went in December 1979, Soviet officials were supremely confident, easy victory. And they gave Western reporters amazing access, even allowing them to ride in rented cars and taxis right alongside Soviet military convoys. But by the spring of 1980, a few months later, the mood had changed. The press was no longer welcome. The war was not going well, and it became a taboo in the Soviet media, controlled media, of course. It was censored out of all public discussion in Russia. And only a few Western journalists who applied for visas were given them. But I was one of the lucky few. And in November 1981, I landed in Kabul on a bright autumn morning after an overnight flight from Delhi. Now, I don't know whether some of you have been to Kabul, but the city sits on a high plateau surrounded by a ring of khaki mountains. The word khaki, by the way, isn't Farsi or Dari word, dusty. Khaki is dust. Khaki means dusty. So we've got the word of importing something from Afghanistan. It's surrounded by a ring of these khaki mountains, and beyond them, glittering in the distance, the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush. It's a magnificent setting. But it wasn't just this magnificent setting that exuded a sense of calm when I arrived in the city in November 1981. The city itself was incredibly calm. I was astonished. Where was the war, I thought? Where were the Russians? I spent 2 weeks in that city, and I also went to Jalalabad and Mazar-e-Sharif, and I saw no Russian troops in any of those 3 cities. It was clear that the Russians, at least, were able to defend on Afghan army and police the urban law and order. The car bombs, the suicide attacks, which have become a permanent threat in Kabul today, were unknown during the Soviet period. Nor was there anything similar to the huge concrete walls which protect the British Embassy and other foreign embassies and Afghan government offices in the capital today. In Kabul now, no American or British diplomat or foreign contractor brings their partner, spouse, partner, or children with them. Far too dangerous. But in the 1980s, Soviet diplomats came with their families. The embassy had a flourishing kindergarten, primary and secondary school. At the city's 2 university campuses, young women were mainly unbanked, as were most of the female staff in banks, shops, factories, and government offices. Only a few wore loose headscarf over their hair, a hijab. Only in the bazaar, where the poorer people shopped, was the all-embracing burqa common. But the countryside was different. I used to go at the weekend to the United Nations guest house in Kabul, which is a favourite place for foreigners to meet and relax over a drink. And aid workers would tell me how frustrated they were at all the restrictions they faced. The UN had dozens of consultants who engaged in agricultural development and rural reform of one kind or another. But they weren't allowed out of the city centre to supervise the projects they were supposed to be running. Afghan government officials admitted that because of the armed insurgents, the so-called mujahideen, land reform was operating in only a quarter of Afghanistan's country districts. Half the schools were closed. It's very similar to the situation today. What is the lesson? Foreign invaders can garrison Afghan cities, yes, with some help from local security forces. They can even keep open the main roads that connect the cities. But penetrating the country's villages and finding support there is a much, much harder, almost impossible task. And it's particularly hard in the south and east of the country, which borders on Pakistan. And every day during the Soviet period, dozens of resistance fighters infiltrated back into Afghanistan from their bases in Pakistan, of course, just as they do today. So let me turn now to some other similarities, but this time in the origins of the Soviet and the American interventions. Well, why did the Russians intervene? When they sent their troops into the country in December 1979, the Afghan government was under attack from traditional conservatives and Islamic fundamentalists who didn't like the government's modernization program, its relatively progressive attitudes to women's rights, which I just described. So the Kabul government found itself under increasing attack from rural areas, and they repeatedly asked for Russian military help. Moscow, just as consistently, said no. Now, the Soviet Union now has, of course, collapsed, and many of the Kremlin's archives are open to researchers. So we actually know a remarkable amount of what went on behind the scenes in the Politburo, including through access to the transcripts of top-level meetings, as though we had transcripts of cabinet meetings today. And they revealed how Alexei Kosygin, who was the Soviet Prime Minister, told the Afghan president in March 1979, after one of these repeated pleas for military aid, if we sent in our troops, the situation in your country would not improve. On the contrary, it would get worse. Very sensible words. Unfortunately, though, by the autumn of 1979, that's March, by the autumn, the Soviet line had changed. Why? Well, there had been a coup in Kabul, and the Prime Minister, Afghan Prime Minister Hafizullah Amin, had murdered the president and taken power. Unfortunately, not an uncommon occurrence in Afghan history. Now, Amin was a bright student in the early 1960s who'd actually won a scholarship to study in the United States. He was at Columbia University in New York City. And there were suspicions in Moscow that he'd been recruited by the CIA while he was there. And they thought that he now was seizing power in order to hand the country over to the Americans and ask the Russians to get out. Now this may sound weird, fanciful, but don't forget that December 1979 was only a few months after Washington's great ally, the Shah of Iran, had been toppled. And if Iran lost to Washington, the Russians feared that America might look for some alternative place, somewhere in Central Asia, a different place, from which to project US power across the region and potentially threaten the southern flank of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev was furious at this coup mounted by Hafizullah Amin and worried by the threat it seemed to represent. So he wanted regime change. Regardless of the warnings that I just quoted from Prime Minister Alexei But rage and revenge are not the best guides to cool decision-making in any context, at home or in politics. But in 1979, in December, they were boiling over in the Kremlin. And the first task that Soviet forces undertook when they arrived in Kabul was to assassinate Amin and replace him with a compliant new leader. Now, the similarities with September 2001, I think, are pretty clear. After 9/11, the Bush administration was also consumed by rage and a desire for revenge. After all, the Taliban had given safe haven to Osama bin Laden, the al-Qaeda leader who was thought to be responsible for 9/11. Bush wanted the Taliban out. And the Americans expected their intervention to be short, just as the Russians did in 1979. They thought regime change would be achieved quickly. And some Americans actually even remembered, they even had some knowledge of history, and they even remembered the Soviet experience. Tommy Franks, who was a general who planned the American invasion, was head of the US Central Command, wrote his memoirs later on. And he recalled telling his colleagues at the time, "We don't want to repeat the Soviet mistakes. There's nothing to be gained by blundering around these mountains and gorges with armoured battalions, chasing a lightly armed enemy." So they took his advice. And the US invasion, if you remember, did not use ground troops. They relied on US air power and missiles, and only a small number of special forces. The bulk of the work of toppling the Taliban was done, the infantry work, if you like, was done by the rebel army of the former Mujahideen, who are now known as the Northern Alliance, and who were still fighting in the very far north of Afghanistan at the time. The Taliban never managed to achieve totally 100% control of the country. The Northern Alliance carried on in the north. And the Americans basically sent special forces with them and bombed the Taliban and allowed the Northern Alliance to move south and capture Kabul and later on Kandahar. Now let's come back to the key differences between the Soviet and American wars, because they're in many ways more important than the similarities, particularly when it comes to the issue of how this terrible war can be ended. In March 1985, the Soviet Union got a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. He inherited a war in Afghanistan that wasn't going well, in which his predecessors had started. His instinct was that the war had become a stalemate 6 years after it had started. The Russians weren't defeating the rebels, the Mujahideen. On the other hand, the Soviet army was not being defeated either. Both sides were trapped in a war of attrition with no end in sight. To check whether his sense that this thing was a complete stalemate was correct, Gorbachev asked the Soviet military commander in Afghanistan, who was called General Mikhail Zaitsev, to evaluate the army's possible options, tell him whether military victory was perhaps possible after all. Zaitsev reported back after a few weeks to say that Afghanistan's open border with Pakistan was the crucial element. The only way to achieve military success, he said, would be to seal the country's borders with Pakistan, and this would require at least 250,000 Soviet troops. He said this was unrealistic. Sounds, I think, pretty familiar with the position today. But Gorbachev had the intelligence to take his military advisor's points on board. He became convinced that his instinct was correct. The war was unwinnable. What about Barack Obama? He too inherited a war which wasn't going well. The Taliban had revived 2 years after their 2001 retreat. They were gaining in strength. Tommy Franks, the US general who I quoted just now, had been warning about repeating Soviet mistakes and not sending thousands of Western troops, had retired. His successors in the Pentagon, as well as their British counterparts in the Ministry of Defence in Whitehall, persuaded the politicians to send Western ground troops in huge numbers in 2004 and 2005. A move which, of course, only encouraged more Afghans to join the resistance against what was seen as an army of foreign occupation, just as more had joined after the Soviets came to the country in 1971. The Afghan population by 2005 was already disappointed. The lack of benefit they could see from all the Western aid that was supposed to be flowing into the country. Unpopular Mujahideen war leaders were coming back to power, and local officials appointed by Hamid Karzai, the president, were seen by most Afghans, and still are, as corrupt. Yet Obama, unfortunately, insisted that Afghanistan was what he called a war of necessity. Unlike Bush's war in Iran, which Obama did say was a war of choice, instead he decided that Afghanistan was a war of necessity. And he tripled the number of US troops that Bush had had in Afghanistan. He continued to press for a military solution. So that's the first enormous difference between the Soviet and the American war. Gorbachev saw the war as unwinnable. Obama's not yet made that deduction. The second crucial difference is that the Soviet military and the civilian leadership were in agreement. The war was a stalemate. I just told you what General Zaitsev said. The top brass made no attempt to oppose Gorbachev's desire to get out. Of course, Gorbachev could have decided to send more troops in, kind of Soviet surge, but he didn't. He could have focused on trying to build up the Afghan army, which is the so-called transition strategy that Britain and the United States are following at the moment. No, Gorbachev chose a different route. To help with the withdrawal, he decided there had to be a political strategy. He invited the Afghan leader, who was called Babrak Karmal, to Moscow, and told him that the Soviets were leaving, and there had to be a political resolution. And he asked Karmal to try and negotiate with the resistance, with the insurgents. And be ready to make concessions, not just negotiate to ask them to surrender, but to be willing to make a compromise deal. The words that Gorbachev used, we know from the archives I just mentioned. If you want to survive, you have to broaden the regime's social base. Forget about socialism. Share real power with the people who have real authority, including the leaders of the bands and organizations that are now hostile towards you, in other words, the armed insurgents. Now contrast this with the policies of Obama and David Cameron and Hamid Karzai, who paid lip service to the concept of negotiations with the Taliban, but still put their main emphasis on military success. Because this transition strategy, which was endorsed in Chicago earlier this year, is designed to keep heavily defended garrisons in Afghanistan in perpetuity. The only difference is that the Afghan troops in instead of British and American ones. That's all the transition means. The war will continue after foreign troops leave in 2014. The only thing that will change is the nationality of the people in all these garrisons, or going out for their occasional patrols. Now, one reason why this worked out is the ethnic imbalance in the Afghan army. Let me give you a little bit of basic sociology here. The largest ethnic group in Afghanistan is the Pashtun, and they make up about 42% of the population. They live in these southern provinces around Kandahar and in the east around Jalalabad, where the Taliban are strongest. Yet the ratio of southern Pashtun in the new Afghan National Army is, wait for it, less than 4%. 4%. The bulk of the Afghan army are Tajiks, Uzbeks, so that in the Pashtun areas, villagers consider them just as foreign as British or American troops. They don't speak the local language. They don't speak Pashtun, they speak Dari or Uzbek. They don't know the area, they've never been there before. So this garrison strategy is doomed. All it does is to perpetuate an unwinnable war with a huge cost in money and, of course, soldiers' lives. Now, unlike the Soviet Union, We pride ourselves in living in a country which does not have censorship. Yet when it comes to free and open discussion of this terrible war, particularly on the BBC, but also in the print media, I often feel that honest analysis and admission of the futility of this war is almost as bad as it was in Moscow in the Soviet period. One reason is that neither the coalition government that we have, nor the opposition party, the Labour Party, questions this war seriously. Even though for the last 3 years, possibly longer, virtually every public opinion poll, who knows better than I do, has shown the majority of British people oppose this war and do not believe that the cause justifies the loss of any more soldiers' lives. Yet the BBC and most British papers give much less space to the majority of our citizens who oppose the war than to the minority who support the Westminster consensus. Now, it's understandable that we do want to treat and honour returning servicemen and women as heroes. But too often the mainstream media uses this sacrifice the troops have made as a way of obscuring the fact, uncomfortable fact, but I'm afraid it's true, that most of the 400 British troops who died met their deaths in vain. We have to be honest, they died in vain. Yet rare is the interview on the BBC or in the print media, including my own paper, The Guardian, with an ex-serviceman or woman who said outright that the war was a waste of lives. Almost never are we allowed to hear the parent or relative of the young soldier who makes the point that this is a war the politicians in the top military brass have got seriously wrong. It's easy to say that about Iraq. They don't dare say it about Afghanistan. Of course, it's usually the case that soldiers don't have the time or the inclination during the war to question why they're actually fighting. They mainly fight, after all, not for some great mission statement in the sky, but simply to protect themselves and their comrades, and not to let the side down. And if they do have doubts, they tend to suppress them. It's understandable. This was true in the Soviet Union, just as it is today. In 1989, a few months after the last Soviet soldier had left, I met a group of Russian veterans in a gloomy housing complex on the eastern edge of Moscow, and talked about what they felt. Now, this is quite a big difference, unlike US and British troops in Afghanistan today, they were conscripts, like American forces had been in Vietnam. So perhaps, of course, they had a heightened sense of anger about what they'd been forced to go through. But nevertheless, even though British troops and American troops now are volunteers, I'm pretty sure that the kind of views that the Russians expressed to me would be echoed by many British squadrons today, and British officers for that matter. Igor said to me, "You remember that mother who lost her son?" She was talking with his colleagues. I spoke to them together. "You remember that mother who lost her son?" She kept repeating, "He fulfilled his duty. He fulfilled his duty to the end." That's the most tragic thing Igor said. What duty? I suppose that's what saves her, this notion of duty. She hasn't yet realized it was all a ridiculous mistake. I'm putting it mildly. If she opened her eyes to our whole Afghan thing, she'd probably find it hard to hold out. Another young veteran, Yuri, told me that he only began to think seriously about the politics of the war after he got back from Afghanistan to Moscow. Slowly, very slowly after the war, he said, you begin to think, to imagine, to remember what happened. The ruined villages, the expressions on people's faces. He said his first glimmerings of the war's futility came when he realized how little contact he and his comrades had with Afghans, people they were supposed to be helping. And it's very similar today. British troops never see an Afghan except a big barrel of gun, as they said at the beginning. Sometimes they never know whether the people they're looking at are insurgents or civilians. They have no normal human interaction. he already said, quotes, mainly our contact was with the kids in the villages we went through. They were always running some kind of little business, swapping stuff, or selling stuff, sometimes drugs. It was very cheap. You felt the aim was to get us hooked. There wasn't much contact with adults, except with the police. Soviet troops were given advice on how to interact with Afghans. And it sounds very similar to what NATO calls cultural awareness training, which they give to troops before they go out. As Igor put it, they gave us a small piece of paper telling us what not to do, and a little dictionary. That was it. Don't fraternize. Don't look at women. Don't go to cemeteries. Don't go to mosques. 2 years later, after those conversations, I found an anthology of letters and poems sent to their families by soldiers serving in Afghanistan in a bookshop. Now, of course, all Soviet soldiers' letters were censored, which is the normal practice in any army in wartime. So many of these young conscripts had only the most basic education, so these letters that have been compiled in the book were obviously quite simple, laconic even, and mainly consisted of pleas to their families, their wives, their girlfriends, not to worry. But every so often I came across a phrase that showed that some soldiers wondered about the point of the mission in Afghanistan. First Lieutenant Sergei Ivanovich wrote to his wife, "I'm so clever. You don't know what you're fighting for, or whether the Afghan people really need us. They're obscure and completely illiterate. They don't even know they've had a revolution. There's a new government in the country. So there's a lot that's incomprehensible and puzzling in this place, and in people's awareness. We have to hunt the rebels and protect these people. It's all very strange." Or take Private Sergei Volodnikov, a farm worker from Kazakhstan, who told his wife in a letter in May 1980. "At prayers, the mullahs tell people that the Russians have come to kill them, and take their wives, and snatch their children. So pick up your guns, go into the mountains, and then the Russians will leave. It's such a pity. They don't understand us, or we them. If only we could explain to them why we've come." His words, I think, would be echoed by many British troops who've been in Afghanistan. But that's the difference. In Russia today, it's universally accepted, almost universally accepted, that 15,000 Soviet soldiers who died, the tens of thousands of Russian troops who fought there and survived, many of them permanently disabled or maimed, did do, as soldiers, the best they could. But those who sent them there made a terrible and tragic mistake. The war, it's accepted in Russia, was fought in vain. But how long, I wonder, would it be before in this country, or in America, politicians who dispatched men and women to this latest war in Afghanistan, as well as the top military brass who keep telling us fraudulently that good progress is being made on the battlefield, how long will it be before they get the public blame for